Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of the Liberty Weekly podcast. I'm your host, as always, Patrick McFarland. This one is number 223, and the show notes may be found at libertyweekly.net/223. And on the line, I have, returning to the show, Adam Fitzgerald. How's it going, man?
Hey, thanks for having me back on, Patrick.
Yeah, really glad to have you back. I really enjoyed our first episode, and it was really popular. I think it was just a topic, like you said, that isn't covered very often, and I think that's incredibly important to cover that.
Yeah, it's one, actually, for me personally, it's one of my favorite podcasts I've ever done because of the obscure nature of the discussion, in which it's hardly ever brought up. I don't think anybody's really talked about it with any great length.
Yeah. Well, so for those of you guys who haven't listened to that first episode, I don't recall the number offhand, but we talked about psychological operations. And I thought it was great because you did an episode on psychological operations that you really kind of started bare bones. Like, what is the military? How do they actually define a PSYOP? Because we throw these terms around in the community, in the liberty movement, but more broadly, and we don't, I guess, really always stop to think about what they mean and get down to brass tacks. How do you define that? So.
Right, and there's different color operations and what they mean and what they're defined as, and there's different levels of government complicity or affiliation with each operation, and there's also disassociation, and they all have like different options regarding each operation, but very intricate and very covert too. Some are very broad and expansive. Some are very condensed and insular. And it's just I really liked that podcast that we did. I loved it.
Yeah. Well, it was great. And so I think this one will be similarly good. And in this, so mainly what you get into is you have spent a long time researching 9/11. You do other various geopolitical coverage as well. And just recently you had an episode on Ukraine. So in touching on the CIA's involvement in Ukraine, and I wanted to get into that, but there's also some revelations about 9/11 and the hijackers that we could get into as well if we have time. But so do you, just to remind the audience, what you want to talk about your work just for a little bit and say where people can find you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm the co-host of The Darkened Hour along with Richard Cox. If you just Google my name and put 9/11 next to it, I pop right up, which is a good thing because I just use my name everywhere on every platform. But on Twitter, you got to put _ Adam Fitzgerald, and I come right up. And on my pinned tweet is all the links to every website that I have, and it's easily accessible there.
Yeah, and I guess for the audience's benefit too, do you want to say kind of what your ethos is on 9/11? You know what I mean? Like the way that you approach it. And I know that you've done a lot of things, calling out, I guess, disinfo agents within the 9/11 realm or movement or something.
Yeah, I mean, I can't really condense 9/11 in 5 to 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Usually people ask me that. I say, do you got like an hour?
Yeah.
But yeah, 9/11 is a very expansive subject that involves a lot of study in different other fields. And I just go a little bit further than the average person. And 9/11 is basically just a huge operation that involved pre-intelligence by domestic and foreign agencies and governments that were involved and benefited from the attacks, which were quite obvious when we invaded Afghanistan, Iraq, and the countries that had nothing to do with it. But I try to discern fringe conspiracy from actual conspiracy because people want to know what I'm about. Am I a truther or a debunker? I usually tell them I'm neither. I'm an independent investigator. I'm a student of this field. And I do have some conspiracies. And yet, because I do believe in planes were hijacked by hijackers, I usually get called the official narrative shill. And because I go a little bit further and say, hey, by the way, we have a real conspiracy involving the intelligence apparatuses that were basically assisting some of these hijackers before the 9/11 attacks even happened. And for the debunking committee, I'm considered a massive fringe conspiracy theorist because I'm adding too much to the story. So they don't know where to put me at. So I would just say I'm a skeptic of both fields, the fringe conspiracy and the official narrative, whatever that may be.
Yeah.
It's usually a vague term anyway, but yeah, I'm right in the middle. And I'm a man unto myself. I'm not in any group or nothing like that. I'd rather work alone because that's how I work best.
Well, and you've done a ton of high-profile interviews with actual officials about this subject. Is that correct? Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. Yeah, I got very lucky. It took a while. It took about a year to build my reputation with these people, and it was well worth it because I'm the only person I ever interview. For example, James Schwartz, the Pentagon incident commander, who's a former fire chief from Arlington. He's never been interviewed. He's done lectures and stuff, but he's never been interviewed. I've interviewed Ken Williams. I'm one of the very few people to interview FBI agent Ken Williams, who was a whistleblower, who actually wrote a memo called the Phoenix Memo, warning the FBI about terrorist cells that were operating inside the United States that were learning at flight schools. And he had an informant in these cells that was giving him information saying the people that were training at these flight schools, some of them don't have the best interests of the United States in mind. He tried to warn them with this memo, and it was ignored. Mark Rossini actually worked at Alex Stations as a CIA virtual station. He's a whistleblower because he tried to warn the FBI about 2 hijackers that were coming inside the United States, and he was not allowed to do so. And the CIA knew about this information, never shared it with the FBI or the State Department. They lived in the United States for 16 months, and they finally told the principals at the principals meeting in August of 2001, but by then it was too late because nobody knew where they were, but the CIA knew, the NSA knew, so he blew the whistle on that, and he got in trouble for it. Anthony Schaefer from Able Danger, the Defense Intelligence Agency, basically was collecting metadata along with an Army unit called the Land Information Warfare Activities Division, where they collected open source and closed source information, classified and declassified information regarding terrorist cells inside the United States. And they were ordered to destroy the information because the information was about U.S. persons. And that was labeling Mohammed Atta, Marwan al-Shehhi, 9/11 hijackers. Meanwhile, they destroyed the information, and it later came out in the Senate Select Committee hearing that the information should have been destroyed because they were not legally U.S. persons. Well, too little, too late. Yeah, so he blew the whistle on that. He got in trouble, big trouble, and his security clearance was actually taken away. So, yeah, I got very lucky in interviewing a lot of these people, and it took a while, but, they got to trust me because they didn't really know much about me, and they wanted to gauge whether I was serious or not, and I hope I proved that to them, and I think I did.
And I don't know if I asked you about this, but if people want to listen to those interviews, where should they go? I don't know if you mentioned it already.
Oh yeah, The Darkened Hour. It's on. Go on my Twitter page, and right there on the pinned tweet is all my links to the websites I go to. But yeah, the name of the show is The Darkened Hour.
Okay, and I know that if you search that on any podcatcher or anything like that, it does come up. And in your Twitter handle, I have on screen for people watching the video version, but it's @ Adam Fitzgerald. So
that's right.
People
yeah,
can find it.
And like I said, my WordPress will come out. It's all my documents and files. My YouTube channel. I think I have now, 2,500 videos up there. And also, my podcast there, The Darkened Hour with Richard Cox.
Okay. Yeah, and I'll have to link that in the show notes page too. But okay, so to get that introduction, just to remind everybody, who you are, what you're about. Let's start with the CIA connections to Ukraine, and then we can get into some of those revelations about Al-Qaeda a bit later. But So one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you about this is because I've been doing my own research, and I don't know, Adam, if you're familiar with my work on the Xinjiang, the Uyghur alleged genocide that's occurring over there.
I've heard about it. I'd never read it.
Well, I released a piece in April of 2021. I did a real big deep dive into these allegations the U.S. State Department is making against the Chinese Communist Party, alleging that they're committing genocide against Uyghur Muslims, which are a Turkic Muslim minority in the far western, the westernmost region of China called Xinjiang, and basically there's not a whole lot of evidence. There's evidence that's proffered, but the evidence it doesn't make the case that genocide or crimes against humanity are being committed there. Now, that doesn't mean China's, I've talked about this a lot on the podcast, but that doesn't mean China's, treating them properly, but it just doesn't mean that it's a genocide or anything like that. So I'm coming out with a new article I've been working on about this because there's a main researcher named Adrian Zenz, who is a senior fellow at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. And that's where all this ties in. But he's an anthropologist, and he's never set foot in Xinjiang, to my knowledge. He does speak Chinese, but he's the one writing all these papers that the U.S. State Department, Mike Pompeo, and Antony Blinken are using to accuse the Chinese Communist Party of genocide on the world stage. So, all that to say that I'm working on this new piece. There's new, leaked documents that he has put forward as being a Chinese government official leaking these documents to him. And I went down a rabbit hole talking about the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation to try and undermine his credibility as a part of that organization. And lo and behold, in my research, I come across this connection between the United States, the State Department, the CIA, and ex-Ukrainian Nazis, Ukrainian Nazi collaborators, mainly through Lev Dobryansky. He was a economics professor at Georgetown University, and he's related to Yaroslav Stetsko. His relation being one of friendship, but they also worked together in this organization. They both created the World Anti-Communist League together. So basically, a lot of these right-wing Cold Warriors in the United States linking up with former Nazi collaborators during the Cold War to fight the Soviets, or at least to do clandestine operations in Ukraine. And I came across a video that you did, I think March 1st of 2022 this year, kind of talking about the same thing. But from what I heard so far, I have the first half of the story and you kind of have the second half. So I don't know where you want to take it from there.
Well, I think, I'll take it simply how I got started in all this, because this is not my area of study, really. Like you said, it's all, I'm boring at just 9/11. So, but like every other American, when this conflict was happening, I knew nothing about Ukraine and the Soviet Union and how far back it went. And my co-researcher, Richard Cox, we both decided to really start, studying and investigating as much as we could. But we didn't want to go through the legacy media, because we already knew that we're going to get a slanted piece. We're not going to get much in the way of really valuable information. And because all wars are basically started by, much like everything else when it comes to conflict, by the intelligence services, we decided to look at a deeper angle, a more general look at the CIA's history involving the Ukraine. And lo and behold, in the last, I think it took us about 10 days, we couldn't believe what we were finding. And basically, it's not something secret, no less. It's basically public information. And the information was basically involving an operation called Operation Aerodynamic. And this was basically a document that was written on August 28, 1953. And it basically was a CIA plan that happened during the I want to say during the Olympics. I think it's 1958, 57, 58 Olympics, where they had a broad program designed to promote anti-Soviet sentiment in the Ukraine. And the program had two goals in mind. And one was to encourage existing anti-Soviet communist Ukrainian nationalist fervor and sentiments. And two was to collect information about Soviet Ukraine and the Soviets as a whole to meet the interests of the United States. And one of the groups that was within this operation was called, and I'm going to butcher it, it's a long word, it's called Accessory. And I know I said it wrong, but I'll letter it. AECASSOWARY. and it was called A Accessory 2, and it was named after a certain person by the name of Mykola Lebed. And Mykola Lebed was a Ukrainian political activist, and he was also a guerrilla fighter and an ardent Ukrainian nationalist. He was also convicted for assassinating a Polish interior minister, Piriaki, I forgot his first name. And he was actually also involved with numerous war crimes, one in which he was involved with the slaughter of tens of thousands of Polish Jews in the Ukraine during in 1939, 38, 39, so to speak. But yeah, Project Aerodynamic was to exploit anti-Soviet Ukrainian resistance groups that were existing in Ukraine. But the project got very big, got very expansive, and it branched out in Eastern Europe. And what happened was it got approval from the CIA, but the CIA also knew about Lebed's history and background. And so they covered that up for decades and decades. And it wasn't until two researchers, I forgot their names. I know I mentioned them in the podcast. I'm sorry. I remember their name. They wrote a book in which they talked about Mykola Lebed and his history with the CIA. And the CIA knew exactly what they were dealing with. This guy's perfect for the agency themselves, because that's what they deal with. They deal with the more nefarious individuals of history in order to operate in a illegal matter so they don't have to do it. So this guy basically was doing the dirty work for him. And then they relocated him inside the United States and got him a business here in Detroit. I think it was Detroit. And basically he was living inside the United States, still working under this operation, using his contacts in Europe to basically collect information about the Soviet Union all the way throughout the Cold War. And basically this operation was secret. So they basically covered this operation up for many, many years. And it wasn't until the release of the book and also the Ukrainian conflict that got light onto the subject. And the media is not reporting on it. They'll talk about Stephen Bandera, of course, and his links to the Ukrainian nationalist group and the organization that they were a part of. But they will never talk about Mykola Lebed because he was a much more nefarious individual who was involved with the slaughter of thousands of Polish Jews. And maybe that's the reason why, because what the media doesn't want you to know is that exactly what's happening right now, or what started the Ukraine war to begin with, was that in 2014, which is called the Revolution of Dignity, the coup that happened to oust Viktor Yushchenko from his democratically elected seat as president, in which they put in an interim government with an overwhelming vote. I think it was like 332 votes to nothing. Basically, it was, the state and the people that basically forced him out. In came his opposition. The opposition took over. And guess who was committing all these crimes against the police and the military? And it was all these separatists. But the separatists were who? Well, they was these neo-Nazi groups that were actually training inside the United States as well as in Ukraine. And this is basically, all this is basically an extension from Operation Aerodynamic that happened decades ago. The CIA never lost their track with these neo-Nazi groups in the eastern Ukraine. And I tried to elucidate the best I could regarding that podcast. And it basically was so popular, which is pretty disappointing because we always talk about 9/11, and it happens to be that we talked about something recent, which ain't surprising. I mean, everybody wants to learn about something new. But yeah, it had to be one of our most popular podcasts that we did. We did a follow-up to it, and that too became really popular. So we tried to keep up with this story as much as possible. But I think the best source involving the CIA and their operation with the Ukraine in the last 15 years was the Daily Beast. And they broke the story about how these right-wing national groups were actually training inside the United States. And it just so happened in 2011 that the House and Senate passed a bill, said that they took off the Azov Battalion as a terrorist group. And what happened? Well, 2.5 years later, they were involved with the overthrow of the democratically elected government of Viktor Yushchenko in 2014. Now, the distance will basically tell you that Yushchenko was corrupt and the people had enough of him. Yeah, that much is true. But what they don't tell you too is that within the mix of those dissidents were these CIA-trained bank ultra-right nationalist groups. And now the media who tried to cover that up are basically saying, yeah, they're neo-Nazis, but not really to that extent of, World War II, for example. So in other words, it's almost similar to like the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in 1979, where they were called freedom fighters. And later on, they became, the terrorists of the war on terror, the enemies of the war on terror. Well, I mean, there's this great quote saying, if you want to find out who tomorrow's enemies are, find out who we're funding today. So, I'm not going to say that maybe in the future, the Azov Battalion will become like the Mujahideen, but they're starting to grow. And by the way, we're spending billions of dollars, and we're going to spend another, I think, Biden just sent another $1 billion in aid to Ukraine, by the way, all during a inflation hike. But he's thinking about another a couple of $1 billion to send in military aid. And it just so happened last year, Bloomberg News broke a story saying that the Pentagon actually came out through human resources and basically said, we don't know where the weapons are going. Hey, isn't that exactly what happened when we sent Stinger missiles to Afghanistan and Pakistan, and they all ended up being in the hands of future groups like Abu Sayyaf, and in Somalia, where we shot down Black Hawk helicopters when we tried to capture Mohammed Farah Aidid, which became a movie, Black Hawk Down? That's exactly what happened. Am I going to say that's going to happen in Ukraine? No, I don't think so. But, those who are doomed to forget the past are doomed to repeat it. So it's like we don't learn. That was the basis for both of those podcasts, was our deep dive into the CIA and these ultra-right groups, which is not a something that's an often forgotten part of history. All throughout Latin America, guess who the CIA was funding in the 70s? It was these ultra-right wing groups that were basically slaughtering liberal newsmen and women and these liberal dissidents and basically leftists, socialists, and they were killing these people. And it basically came out through the Iran-Contra and what we were doing with the Contras and the scandal that broke out, sending weapons and killing these people. They don't care. So basically, that's what's happening in Ukraine. And the media isn't reporting it. And we expected as much, but we didn't expect a total whitewash of like the neo-Nazi groups that are acting in accordance with the police and military now. And basically, they're just saying, oh, well, they're patriotic. I didn't know about that either.
Yeah, right. Well, in some of them even marching, I had an article here talking about how even in 2014 there were members of the Right Sector and Swoboda Party who were marching with the Nazi, was it the 2nd Division armbands on? Yeah, and that was an SS unit, but it wasn't one of the Ukrainian SS divisions. That is that the Galician SS. But I wanted to pull up that quote that the weapons disappearing into a big black hole, because I think you said that they're disappearing, but I think the quote was from intelligence briefings, a big black hole. Connor Freeman writes, nor do all our all-knowing rulers appear concerned with the fact that they have almost zero ability to keep track of the myriad sophisticated weapon systems they are sending to Ukraine. CNN quoted brief sources saying intelligence shows American arms are falling into a, quote, big black hole. They say it's worth it. So it's like, not only are they disappearing, it's like they're being sucked into a black hole. And moreover, Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com, I think he reported today that Blinken still has not met with his Russian counterpart since mid-February, since before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so, I mean, it would seems like that would tend to show that they're actually prolonging the conflict, or at least not seeking an end to it.
Well, I mean, George Orwell once wrote in 1984 that war was not meant to be won; it was meant to be continuous.
Yeah.
And of course, it benefits who? I mean, the private military industrial corporations like LG3 Technologies, Raytheon, and Boeing for the war to continue. And of course, we're throwing money away. Like there's like not even an argument in the House and Senate regarding some of this funding aid that we're going to. It's unanimously agreed that we send this billions of dollars in aid. And meanwhile, like I said, the country's like economically being deprived of, this aid that we desperately need. But when it comes to our interests in, not just the Middle East, but in Eastern Europe, you're damn straight we're going to spend as much possible in order for this war to continue, even if it comes at the cost of Ukrainian life. And that's exactly what's happening. And we saw that in Syria with the Arab Spring. And after that, we came, to try to force the overthrow of the Assad government by a CIA-funded program called Timber Sycamore, in which we spent millions and millions of dollars, hundreds of millions, to aid who? The terrorists that we were supposed to be fighting at the same time, groups like al-Nusra and the Islamic State. And we're sending military, we're training them too. And this group basically, at the same time is fighting both the United States and the Syrian government at the same time. And it's basically, nobody talks about it. And just like nobody talks about all this billions of dollars in aid to Ukraine and where the weapons are going. Well, I'll tell you where the weapons are going. They're basically being sold in the black market to who? God knows who. Could be anybody. Could be the Islamists in Syria, who, by the way, incidentally enough, are joining the fight against the Soviets because they didn't forget that it was the Soviets who decimated the Islamic State in Damascus and in Deir ez-Zor. So basically, they want to join these neo-Nazi groups, and all these ghouls are basically, being funded by who? The most ghoulish state of all, the CIA.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, even in the one Daily Beast article, there was an interview that was done by one of the Azov battalion sergeants called Ivan Kharkiv, who basically said about his experience with U.S. trainers and volunteers. And he said that, and I'm going to quote you from the article, it says, even mentioning U.S. volunteers and engineers and medics that are assisting them, he talks about them in the highest regard. He talks about the significant and active support from the Ukrainian diaspora in the United States. So his group, basically the Azov Battalion, some of them were even training inside the United States. And according to anonymous sources in the Pentagon, and that was 3 sources the Daily Beast got from, they basically were somewhere in the Southwest, the United States, training them. And that this comes at no shock, because this is exactly what we did with Timber Sycamore in Syria. This is exactly what we did with Operation Cyclone in Afghanistan in 1979. This is exactly what the CIA did all throughout the late 1970s, early 80s in Central America. So it comes at no surprise that the CIA is dealing with these, ultra-right, whether they be nationalists or theocrats, to do the bidding of the state without probably them even realizing it.
And I have a quote here, an article from antiwar.com. Kyle Anzalone, my Libertarian Institute colleague. There was a report, CIA European commandos operating on the ground in Ukraine. That's from the New York Times and CNN just a week, 2 weeks ago. I know that because I was gonna ask you. So to clarify, there was the Daily Beast article you were referring to, stating that that there's Ukrainians that were being trained by the United States before 2014. Because I know that there was a report from Yahoo News that said that there were members of the Ukrainian military that were being trained in the United States, but that was after 2014, to my knowledge.
Yeah, and like I said before, I think, and I got the year wrong, it was 2015 when the House passed a bill to take the Azov Battalion off the terrorist watch list. And it came right at the heels of the overthrow of the Yushchenko government, by the way. I think it was like just a month or 2 later. It just so happens, right? So that's what happened with the Azov Battalion. But yeah, like I said, this should come as no surprise to anyone who's slightly familiar with the CIA's involvement with these right-wing separatist groups all throughout Central America, Middle East, and Eastern Europe. And what came to me as a surprise was just how long the CIA's involvement with these separatist groups that go all the way back to the Cold War, at the start of it. And even dealing with people that were involved with war crimes involving with the deaths of thousands of Polish Jews like Mikola Lebed was, and basically dealing with somebody like that, not realizing that maybe in the future you're going to deal with the repercussions if that ever came out, and it certainly did with the publishment of that book. And I hate to say that I used it. I remember linking that document and book into my podcast, and if you bring that up, that'll come up, and I have to forgive me if those two authors are basically listening to this somehow, and I just can't remember their names. And that's it right there. You got it.
Yeah,
Hitler's Shadow.
Hitler's Shadows, Nazi War Criminals, U.S. Intelligence in the Cold War. Richard Brightman and Norman, is it Goda?
Yeah, Goda. Thank you.
Goda.
That's them.
And
yeah, they broke the story.
Well, so we'll put that in the show notes page too. I wanted to touch on this too, to go back to the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists and Stepan Bandera, but also this connections to Lev Dobryansky and the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, because at least that's the part that I kind of looked into. But you hear all of this talk about like Stepan Bandera and Yaroslav Stetsko. Because in my research, Adam, it occurred to me that, you know, there were the McCarthyites during the Cold War in the United States, and kind of the right, the Republicans who were shaming these OSI investigations, which were, the OSI was an organization created by Congress to hunt down Nazi war criminals. And it seemed that at least the Republicans at the time, and here's an article that was, I think, linked by Gareth Porter. My audience should recognize Gareth's name at the Gray Zone, in an article reporting on this, Adrian Zenz and the VOC, we'll call it Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. But if you go in here, this is an article for those of you who are not watching the video. It's from 1985 by Joe Conason, talking about Reagan's involvement with these Ukrainian fascists. And if you go down, you can see, in practical terms, it means that the OSI is looking for war criminals among the Eastern European ethnic communities: Ukrainian, Lithuanian, Latvian, Estonian, Romanian, Croatian, where ultra-conservatism and support for Reagan are overwhelming. The communal organizations of the so-called captive nations are a bulwark of Reagan's hardcore political coalition, and it is unsurprising that they are trying to destroy OSI to prevent the deportation of its targets. What he talks about here, aside from that, is this concerted effort by the right during the Cold War to suppress OSI, hunting Ukrainian Nazis, and hunting, you know, these Eastern European kind of Nazi nationalist coordinators. And it just seems like one of those connections was Lev Dobryansky. And I don't know if I failed to mention this, but Lev Dobryansky was a co-founder of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. Another co-founder was Zbigniew Brzezinski, and he was Jimmy Carter's former national security advisor. So I don't know. Sorry, I've kind of monopolized the conversation here. Do you have anything to add?
No, I'm not familiar with that, but there's so much involved with the Operation Aerodynamic as well that I didn't get into. But I mean, if you listen to the podcast episode that me and Richard did, we outlined in detail about the necessary, the operational structure of the operation, and involved a lot of organizational cells within the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, because there was a split within that group during the early 20th century. And so that we talk about Mikola Lebed and Stepan Bandera a lot in that podcast episode.
And I guess just to try and outline it pretty quickly, did Bandera start OU? Well, he started the OUNB faction, which was the split group.
There was a split between him and Yemen. I'm going to butcher his name. Korniovic or something like that. Korniovic
Okay.
it's a very hard name to spell. Yeah, there was a split in the early 20th century between um, members of the more moderate part of the OUN, and then there was another group called the OUN uh, B or D or something like that, and that was Bandera's group.
Oh yeah, the OUNB.
Okay, OUNB.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I guess the importance here that I'm trying to get at is to kind of undermine the VOC as an organization, because they have been at the front of these like seemingly CIA. I'm using that as a broad term, but these U.S. intelligence efforts to undermine countries with authoritarian regimes at the head. So, like these regime change operations, and right now they're at the forefront of this effort to overthrow, I think, regime change in Beijing is just my theory, with these allegations of genocide against the Chinese Communist Party. But you've seen them. I mean, the VOC has been, involved with groups like Radio Free Europe and Radio Free Asia, trying to undermine these regimes abroad. But I guess I just want to get it out that the connection. So Stepan Bandera, I think he was killed. Was it in 1959 or 1949? And after that, his lieutenant Yaroslav Stetsko takes over. And these are actual Nazi collaborators when the Germans came into Ukraine. Yaroslav Stetsko himself marched with them as they marched down Lviv. And this person is a close confidant of Lev Dobryansky, who is a founding member of the VOC. And I even went through, and Georgetown University has a log of his personal his correspondence with who he corresponded with, and it's on their database, the .edu website, and Yaroslav Stetsko is on there, that him and Dobryansky were communicating back and forth. So it's just like an interesting chapter I kind of wanted to poke at just a little bit. I mean, nothing exhaustive, but enough to write a paragraph or two about in an article, or something to keep in mind when the VOC says that an authoritarian regime is committing mass murder,
Yeah, I mean, it's happening all throughout history. I mean, but what's we're never going to get like the truth when it comes to like legacy media. And I see it all the time and I shouldn't be shocked, but I am sometimes, because, I can't get it in my head to think that, the public itself can't get over the fact that, when I see people with Ukrainian flags on their hashtag names and stuff like that, that they realize, hey, do you realize that the CIA is basically funding these right-wing separatist groups to overthrow a democratically elected government?
Yeah.
And that's not the first time in history. And then they basically say, well, that's not true. Where did you get that from? And then when you show them, basically you're seen as a crackpot like Tucker Carlson or Alex Jones. And meanwhile, I don't like them either. And I'm trying to tell them, hey, listen, there's a history that you're not being told. And I was just like you once. And all I did was basically look up the public record and behind the history behind the Ukrainian nationalists and the CIA, and lo and behold, it's out there. It's not, I didn't pay for the information in some underground garage. It's out there.
Right, exactly.
But the media is not going to report on it because they got, a slant to sell.
Yeah. Well, and I further, like you said, I mean, this Yaroslav Stetsko was someone who marched with the Nazis on Lviv, right? And then later on, Stetsko assumed leadership of the OUNB in 1959 when Bandera was killed, but then he came to the United States. So this author, this is an interview that that's on screen right now. It says Stetsko was the number 2 leader of the OUN during World War II and thereafter. In 1959, Bandera, who was head of the OUN, was killed, and that's when Stetsko assumed the leadership. Stetsko in 1941 was the guy who actually marched into Lviv with the German army on June 30th, 1941, and the OUN issued a proclamation at that time under his name, praising and calling for glory to the German leader Adolf Hitler, and how they're going to march arm in arm for the Ukraine and so forth. After the war, he was part of the key leadership that got picked up by the Americans. And then I was trying to see, so what happened when Stetsko and others like him from other German allied forces came to the United States? In the U.S., when they came, his groups organized captive nations committees. They became supposedly the representatives of people who were being oppressed in Eastern Europe, the Baltic countries by the Soviets. But they were in fact being given an uncritical blank check to represent the voices of all these nations that were part of the Warsaw Pact, when in fact they represented the most extreme elements of each of the national communities. I think that's, I think he mentions that guy that you were talking about.
Nicole of it.
Yeah. Because he talks about how the U.S. brought him to Detroit.
Yep.
Yeah.
And it was the CIA that funded his business too.
Yeah. Well, that's crazy.
Yeah.
And so I think this is a good segue, though, to state that, like this interview. This is an interview with Russ Bellant, author of, quote, Old Nazis, the New Right, and the Republican Party. And I think it's important to notice, like he notes in the paragraph I just read, that these are fringe elements that just have a lot of influence and power, probably due to, their relationship with the U.S. intelligence agencies, but they don't represent the majority of Ukrainians, for instance.
Right.
But I mean, like there's that whole mythos about the American Revolution, the 3%ers, right? Is that it was 3% of people who wanted revolution. And so when you have a really influential, active, small minority, they can, they can lead the charge in something like the Maidan Revolution.
Right. And also, I just remember, too, when Mikola Lebed was actually in prison for killing the Polish minister in 1939, when the Nazis invaded Poland, he was actually freed by the the Germans. And he actually worked with them, collaborated with them. Well, 1 year later, Stephen Bandera actually worked with German intelligence. And when they declared Ukraine to be a free, independent state, they thought that the Nazi Germans basically would make fascism basically the predominant law of the land. And what followed was a violent wave of violent pogroms that happened. And of course, what happened was the slaughter of tens of thousands of Polish Jews. And who was right behind it? Well, Mikola Lebed and Stephen Bandera, the very same people who worked with the CIA and, of course, the German intelligence, as well as being covered up by the CIA later on. And all these people who basically are waving, Ukrainian flags and thinking that, it's the nasty Soviets. And by the way, the Soviets aren't right for invading, the disputed territories of Luhansk and Donetsk. But nevertheless, the Ukrainians don't have clean hands either. And that's exactly the point we were trying to make in those podcasts.
Yeah. And by Soviets, you mean Russian, right? The Russians?
Right. Yep.
Yeah.
Russian, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify for the audience. Yeah, it's crazy. And there's so much here and so much to get through. And, hindsight being 2020, looking at the situation now, it's like, well, of course we're at the point where we're at. It's of course this turned into an international crisis. There were people talking for decades about how this was a boiling pot. It just waiting to overboil. One thing I pointed to is, I don't know if you're familiar with Robbie Martin's Very Heavy Agenda.
Yeah.
But there's, watching that, he goes through a lot of like the neoconservative think tanks and the groups behind like the Foreign Policy Initiative and Bill Kristol and all those guys being involved. Robert Kagan and, of course, Victoria Nuland, his wife. But this huge effort to be involved in Ukraine by those groups specifically, but then just seeing the writing on the wall that he documents with clips in that documentary he produced is crazy. It's like, of course this happened.
Yeah, and as you bring up that Victoria Nuland Actually, there's an infamous phone call that basically got scrubbed off the internet. And when it happened, I actually ripped it and
Oh, you
I
did good.
saved it. I think I shared it on my Twitter page once, and it was actually shared like over 500 times. So, like one of my famous tweets. And usually, I'm a small channel. I was surprised at the amount of it.
Yeah.
Basically, she was talking to the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Hyatt or Hyatt or something like that, and they don't know what date the phone call took place, but basically it was talking about the Ukrainian crisis, how the United States is going to facilitate the crisis to an extent to where there's going to be a revolution, the ouster of Yushchenko and whatnot. And yeah, that phone call actually was legitimate. It actually came from Victoria Nuland. And I think Victoria Nuland, there was a video I once posted regarding, I think our husband is Robert Kagan or something like that.
Yeah, it is. It is Robert Kagan.
Right, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it talked about how there was a big contract that was awarded from Kagan to Ukraine in like millions of dollars and stuff like that. I mean, look, there's no question about how they facilitate these crises in order to take advantage of a crisis.
Yeah.
I mean, look, what happened in 2014? Well, basically, one war is basically depleted now, the war on terror. There are no large terrorist groups. Al-Qaeda is decimated. The Taliban was basically, decimated at that point. Now they're being regenerating now because we basically left the country. Now they took over the country. So we need a new war. And what better way to facilitate a crisis that's happening in Eastern Europe? And in order to do that, we need information. That's where the intelligence agencies come in. And so they use the CIA as basically as the agitator to facilitate crises like that. And that's exactly what happened.
And have you seen some of the neoconservatives' attempts to try to pour water on, people claiming that the United States facilitated the 2014 coup? That I think because you try to manage your claims, right? And you don't want to overstate the involvement of in the same way you don't want to overstate the influence of these Nazi paramilitary groups in Ukraine, in Ukrainian leadership specifically. But you don't want to overstate the U.S.'s role in causing the 2014 coup or leading it or whatever. I think it's clear that the U.S. tried to get involved. Take for instance this, Adam. I wrote a piece recently about Brzezinski bragging about starting causing the Soviets to invade Afghanistan in the 80s, right? And it's like in Fool's Errand, Scott, while interviewing Eric Margulies and I think some other figures, Scott kind of pours water on this idea that Brzezinski actually caused the Soviets to invade because, he has incentive to play up his own role in history and present himself as being some kind of mastermind. Have you read any neoconservatives or anyone else who tries to argue that, the U.S. That phone call doesn't really prove anything, that the U.S. was actually had caused the revolution or things to that effect, downplaying the U.S.'s role?
I think the only time I read something like that was William Crystal because he's active on Twitter.
Was it?
And basically tried to downplay that phone call.
Yeah.
Now that you mention it, basically, and I think that's the reason why I posted on my Twitter was because of that. Because I find Crystal to be repugnant, and so does Scott Orton, by the way.
Yeah.
So
I think
that's the reason why I posted that was in response to what he said.
Yeah.
About Victoria Nuland's phone call.
Well, did you know that? Do you know Jordan Peterson? I just have to mention this.
Yeah, I don't follow him, but I know him.
Did you know that he interviewed Fred Kagan? He was the first person out that. Oh. Yeah, he interviewed Fred Kagan about Ukraine within a week or two of the invasion. I believe it was.
Oh, wow. No, that's news to me.
Well, and I was just kind of blown away because I guess I didn't really know Peterson's stance on foreign policy issues. Mm-hmm. Right. Does he fall in line with a Ben Shapiro or something like that?
No, in fact, this comes as a very surprise to me because usually he's more philosophical than anything is political.
Yeah.
But yeah, his politics are very rare.
Yeah.
And he does venture into theology here and there, spirituality more so than theology. But as for political affiliations, not necessarily. No.
Yeah.
So that comes as a big surprise. And of all people, Fred Kagan. Wow.
Well, I was shocked too. I mean, Jesus Christ, Fred fucking.
Yeah,
Kagan,
really. If you got, he went hardcore there.
Right. Yeah. It's like, I mean, okay. Let's invite the devil himself onto my podcast to explain the Ukrainian crisis.
Don't build up to it, right? Just go right at it, right in the devil's mouth.
Yeah, yeah. Or you could invite the fox. After the hen house has been stormed, you invite the fox with feathers hanging out of his mouth.
Right, exactly. I'd never see, like I said, I don't follow Peterson, but I do know who he is, and I do generally know what he's about. But as for politics, I never seen him speak anything about politics. And for him to interview Fred Kagan, wow, that's surprising for the least.
Well, you should. I think not only once, he did it twice. They had like a part 1 and a part 2, and I don't think the part 2 was planned at the end of part 1. But there were like some developments, and he was like, "Well, I just had to have you back on,"
Oh my God! Yeah. And to invite him back on, that would, for me, that would be very, very surprising. Because I would think that Peterson was, if I was going to label him politically, centrist left, but nowhere near like hard neocon. No way. Yeah. Because he actually is anti-war. So I mean, for him to interview one of the most warmongering families on the face of the earth, the Kagan family, that's a surprise to me.
Yeah, I was really surprised about it, and I kind of pictured. I mean, I know Jordan Peterson he's viewed as being like a radical right, because now everything in this lexicon, right, and everyone left, everyone right of center is a right wing extremist. So I know to like the left, at least on social issues, which is the culture war has been his forte, but he doesn't talk too much about foreign policy. And then just to go like full on Ben Shapiro type, with having Fred Kagan on. But hey everybody, welcome to the portion of the show where I tell you how you can help support this content. It is at my new membership website, libertyweekly.club. And I know I've been announcing this, but I left Substack, rolled out a new membership website that operates the same way. You get content through your email address, but there's also a webpage, libertyweekly.club, where you can go and read the articles. And it works really great so far. Just a couple hiccups in terms of trying to figure out how to use free previews for people who are just signed up to the free newsletter. And for people who sign up through the membership here, you can see that right now I have a $5 a month tier that will get you access to early access to episodes of Liberty Weekly, access to bonus episodes that I've been trying to come out with 2 times a month, preprint access to all my Libertarian Institute articles before they're published, and I'm working on setting up a subscribers-only live stream. I'd like to do that before the end of the month. Which I will announce through the email list. So if you go through, sign up for the email list, libertyweekly.club, hit the subscribe button. You can choose the free tier, or you could choose the $5 per month tier, which will get you access to the benefits. But for free content, there still is free content up there. Like I do a lot of article content there. So head on over to libertyweekly.club. The other thing that I'm really excited to announce is a collaboration between myself and Ludwig von Mises Pieces, which is the guy who does all my graphics and thumbnails, and the guy who, he does a ton of awesome work. So you can see Liberty Weekly merch is now available if you head on over to libertyweekly.net this time /merch, MERCH. You'll be able to find Liberty Weekly merch with my new logo with the rising sun and Lady Liberty holding the shield and flag. I really like the logo that he was able to do for me. And you can see that you can get coffee mugs there. You can get sweatshirt. You can get t-shirts and all that kind of stuff. The other collaboration. Oh, and if you use promo code LW10, that will get you 10% off. And it will also get a kickback to me and show him that you bought through my link. But you could also go through all the other merchandise that he has there. There's lots of good stuff. You buy anything in the store with promo code LW10, and I will also get a kickback. You can see a bunch of stickers and T-shirts and designs that people in our sphere of the Liberty movement will just love all that, the merch that he has there. It's original stuff that he's made himself. And we did a collaboration on a T-shirt, that idea that I had, Dissolve NATO, super timely right now. But for those of you just listening to the audio version only, it's the NATO logo that is being shattered into a million pieces, and it says Dissolve NATO on it. So I think it's a really cool, timely T-shirt. Of course, it was an idea that I'd commissioned, and I think that he did an awesome job with it. And if you like my thumbnails and logo art, Ludwig von Mises Pieces did Why I Am Anti-War podcast logo, which is a dove coming out of a helmet. And I really, really like that logo too. So check out this Dissolve NATO. You can get it in sticker format. You can get it on a sweatshirt or a T-shirt. And I'm going to be picking some of these up myself because I think they turned out really awesome. So again, head on over to libertyweekly.net/merch. And to get the NATO T-shirt, head on over to libertyweekly.net/NATO, NATO. All right, so that's all the stuff I got for you guys this week. Thanks everyone for subscribing, all the members at libertyweekly.club. Really appreciate it. You really help me afford all the hosting costs and to upgrade my equipment and all that kind of stuff too. So, all right, thanks. Peace. Well, so I missed a really great transition point earlier when you had ended saying, well, this is what the intelligence communities do, right? That was a good bookend point for our Ukraine discussion, I think, that I just blew past. But I if we could return to that moment and transition over to the revelations about Al Qaeda and 9/11 and Saudi Arabia, correct?
Yeah, actually, it's a big story, but it's not reported anywhere, barely.
And I don't know if you had sent me a link. Yeah, you did. I'll pull up that article that you sent me the link to originally on Twitter.
Sure.
And just put that on screen. But do you want to start with, because I have not covered 9/11 on this podcast. In the early days, I had flirted with 9/11 truth a bit, but not in any kind of really informed way. But you bring the actual facts about the hijackers. And so here was some new revelations. But before we get into that, I don't even know where you start with some kind of like basic explain it like I'm 5.
Well, I'll try to do my best for you. But no, I could give like a short history about this specific subject.
Yes.
Where it can make a lot of sense for everybody. Well, there were 2 Al-Qaeda operatives named Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi. And they were living in a house in Yemen at the time. Khalid al-Mihdhar was. And this Al-Qaeda communications hub, as it was called, was a house owned by Ahmed al-Hada, who was an associate of bin Laden from the Soviet-Afghan war. And basically, this house became a communications hub for Al-Qaeda throughout the world. And the CIA and the NSA knew about this, so they were bugging the house. And it just so happens they overheard a phone call. And this phone call was from a known Al-Qaeda operative named Khalid, who was talking to Khalid al-Mihdhar, telling him about a very important meeting in Malaysia. And so they traveled to this Malaysia meeting in January 5th of 2000. They stood there for 3 days. And the NSA monitored them while they were there too. And so they sent this information to the CIA's virtual station called the Bin Laden Issue Station, which was codenamed Alex Station. And basically, they collect all information about Al-Qaeda. So they left that meeting. And while they left the meeting, they stood in a hotel. And there's 2 stories to this. But one of the famous stories is that when they were in the hotel, while they were out of their room, the CIA basically took photographs of their passports. And on their passports were U.S. visas. So they were coming into the United States after their stay in Bangkok, Thailand, at this hotel. In United Arab Emirates. So while they were there, they then entered the United States on January 15th of 2000, all with the knowledge of the CIA and the NSA. But they didn't allow the FBI to know about this, even though they had the information, but they couldn't share it. The FBI read the cable where they showed that these guys were coming to the United States and they both had U.S. visas. But the FBI has to get permission from the CIA to use their information, and they were told, no, you're not allowed to share the information with the FBI. So they come to the United States, and as soon as they come to the United States, they're automatically met by a Saudi named Omar al-Bayoumi. Omar al-Bayoumi basically ran into him in a very dingy restaurant, and the name of the restaurant, which is not there anymore, was called the Mediterranean Cafe, and it was on, I want to say it was Valencia Avenue. I could be wrong about the street, but it was right near the King Fahd Mosque in downtown Los Angeles, near Culver City. So basically, Omar al-Bayoumi told the 9/11 Commission that he was in the restaurant. And then in came Khalid al-Mihdhar and Wafa Hazmi. They spoke Arabic, so did he. And he basically introduced themselves. And he said that, what are you doing in the country? And they said, we're just new. And he provided for them, got them help to get their driver's license, paid for their first 2 months' rent in an apartment in San Diego, threw a big housewarming party for them, which is basically on camera. And what happened was, it just so found out that he had an associate with them, and his name was Kaysan bin Dan. Kaysan bin Dan was also interviewed by the FBI, and he told a much different story, in that he was with Omar al-Bayoumi at the King Fahd Mosque. And the King Fahd Mosque imam is Fahad al-Thumeri. And Fahad al-Thumeri told Omar al-Bayoumi to go pick up these 2 Saudis. Now, whether he told them their names or not, was that it's fine, but they're going to be at this restaurant. So they go to the restaurant, and basically they walked in, according to Kaysan bin Dan, and Khalid al-Mihdhar and Wafa Hazmi were already there. So what happened was Omar al-Bayoumi basically lied. But Omar al-Bayoumi, anyway, provided them with months' rent and whatnot. Now, there was a lot of conspiracy behind this after the 9/11 attacks. Who were these men? The FBI interviewed them. He basically gave an open testimony. Parts of it's redacted, but the majority of the story is unredacted. And he basically said that, I don't work for any Saudi government. I basically did feel sorry for them. I gave them money. I had no idea they were going to be involved with the attacks. But a couple of people persisted and said that they think that he works for a Saudi government official. Well, it just so happened, in April of last year, a story broke from NorthJersey.com that I read. And I was like one of the very first people to break this story, besides them and the FBI who posted the story. And basically what happened was the FBI, through the Biden administration, the FBI released a bunch of documents and files. There's 511 pages of it. And a lot of it's redacted. But for the stuff that's unredacted, what happened was one document that is from the Pent Bomb FBI investigation involved the hijackers and al-Qaeda affiliates involved with the September 11 attacks, called the Pent Bomb investigation. In this one document, it basically outlines that Omar al-Bayoumi had worked for a government airline agency called the Saudi International Group or whatever. It was an airline company, Saudi Airlines or something like that. It was a government agency. And basically, he's been an employee with them since 1975. He's been working for this company. And basically, Omar al-Bayoumi lied. He basically straight up lied to the 9/11 Commission. So why did he lie? Basically, he was getting payments from this government, and he was using those payments to give money to these 2 al-Qaeda operatives. Now, what the report doesn't say is that they knowingly were providing this funding to Bayoumi, who knew that these 2 men were up to no good and they were involved with the 9/11 attacks. That's not what the file says. But Omar al-Bayoumi basically lied about working for a government agency. And it just so happened that the person that hired him, Saad al-Thumeri or something like that, his son, who was on a FBI watch list, top 10 most wanted list, they found a CD-ROM with his passport, along with the passports of 3 other hijackers, Abdulaziz al-Amari, Khalid al-Mihdhar, and Salim al-Hazmi, the brother of Nawaf al-Hazmi. So that goes to show you that a relative, a son of the person who worked for a government agency is involved with these hijackers at some level, and he's given payments to an intermediary inside the United States in which he lied about. And there's a direct connection between the Saudi government and the 9/11 attacks through payments. And that's not the only one, right? But when this story broke out, it wasn't a peep on the internet, nowhere. And I remember reading it at like 2 in the morning. I was just about to go to bed, and I saw this the story on NorthJersey.com. I couldn't believe it. It just reiterated everything that I knew, but I just everything that I believed, but I just didn't know. And now we know. And I remember running to my computer and doing a video about it, and it was like 3:30 in the morning, and I was so blown away by what I read. And then when I went through the documents and files, and I read all 511 pages in less than a week, and because I couldn't believe what I was reading. And not only that, there was another Saudi operative by the name of Osama Basnan, who was meeting with an FBI informant, and regarding that he was also talking with people that were involved with the 9/11 attacks. But like the informant tried to get as much information as much as possible, but he knew more than what he was alluding to. And he too was being interviewed by the FBI, and he basically lied about that too. And the FBI also interviewed Fahad al-Thumairy, the imam at the King Fahd Mosque. And he basically was deceptive, not with the FBI, but also with the 9/11 Commission. Because when they showed him pictures of Khalid al-Mihdhar Nawaf Hazmi, he was in Saudi Arabia at the time. But when they showed him the pictures, he said, I don't know these two men. And there was a Saudi intelligence officer from the General Intelligence Directorate behind him, and he whispered in his ear. And Fahad al-Thumairy said, oh, yes, I know these two men. They were on TV for the 9/11 attacks. Meanwhile, he lied about that because basically he told not Omar al-Bayoumi to go meet these two men, but there was another operative, not much of an operative. He was a Tunisian cab driver, and his name was Khalid Ben-Amarine. And Khalid Ben-Amarine met with Fahad al-Thumairy in early January, and Fahad al-Thumairy told him, you're going to pick up these two men from the airport, but he didn't name their names. And when he picked up these two men, he brought them to Fahad al-Thumairy. He drove away. Well, after the 9/11 attacks, the FBI went and interviewed everybody in Culver City and found Khalid Ben-Amarine. And when they showed him these photographs of these 30 people, hey, could you point out to the two men that you picked up? Well, he pointed out two pictures right away. Those two pictures were Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi. And then he put him back in the shuffle. What happened? Well, there's a direct connection between a Saudi government official, Fahad al-Thumairy, and the two hijackers. So it's not just one anomaly. There's multiple anomalies. And by the way, the FBI director, Robert Mueller, killed that case, just like he killed the case into Omar al-Bayoumi and his connections with the Saudi government and the FBI investigating him for years. He killed all those connections. So this story is monumental. It is huge because it now shows that we have a direct connection between the Saudi government, who has an affiliate, a son, that is involved with, at some level, the hijackers of 9/11, who is paying an intermediary who lied about his connection with the government to two of the 9/11 hijackers. There's a direct connection. And guess what? It's not being reported by anywhere. Well, 3 weeks later, CBS and ABC, slight reporting. They didn't ban, but by the way, this wasn't blaring on front page news like it should be. It's enormous news. It's gigantic. But of course, the State Department, the FBI, doesn't want the public to know because it's the State Department that still continues to this day to cover up for the Saudis. Now, just to go off tangent, I interviewed Ken Williams, like I said before, the Phoenix agent with the FBI. When he retired, he actually went to work with a law firm called Creedler & Creedler to help with the civil suit against Saudi Arabia. The FBI called him and told him, don't help with the victims' families. And that was mind-blowing to me. But he basically went and did. He said, I'm going to help them. And he basically did. And that, he shared that with me in the podcast. And I said, why do you think they did that? Because, well, they got pressure from the State Department. And basically is that their relationship with Saudi Arabia supersedes, yes, even the victims' families suing for 9/11. And it just goes to show you where their loyalties rely on. Not with the American people, but with the Saudi and their interests. That's all.
So this article that you sent me, is there something specific about the video that we were talking about? Because you mentioned the 500 and something pages, right?
Yeah.
What is the video show?
Well, it shows Omar al-Bayoumi in it, and it shows Khalid al-Mihdhar in it as well. And I think in that video, Khalid al-Mihdhar is wearing a yellow shirt, but it shows that Omar al-Bayoumi was walking around. Now, according to eyewitnesses that knew Omar al-Bayoumi in San Diego, he would always walk around with a video camera. And there's a picture of Khalid al-Mihdhar in the party that they threw, like I mentioned, when they did a housewarming party for him. They thought that Omar al-Bayoumi was a Saudi agent. Now, later on, Khalid al-Mihdhar, when he moved out, him and Nawaf al-Hazmi, they moved in, they rented a room in San Diego, and it just so happened it was an FBI informant. And his name was Abdus Sheikh, and his code name was Stan with the FBI. And he basically, Khalid al-Mihdhar told Abdus Sheikh that they didn't trust Omar al-Bayoumi, and they thought that he was a Saudi agent. Even the hijackers, didn't trust him because he would always walk around with a video camera and taking pictures. And that video camera was handed to an associate who we don't know was shooting. And it just so happened that Omar al-Bayoumi was in, and there's Omar al-Bayoumi right there. Omar al-Bayoumi was also caught in the camera video. And there's very few pictures of Omar al-Bayoumi, but that video basically shows Omar al-Bayoumi and Khalid al-Mihdhar in the video.
And here's Bayoumi with Anwar al-Awlaki?
Yeah, Anwar al-Awlaki, a Yemeni preacher that also met with Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi. And he's also, I think, the only American civilian that was killed by a drone strike under the Obama administration. They killed him and his son.
In the same strike, yeah.
Yeah.
Was it in the same? It was in
no,
the same
it was two different strikes.
Oh, so they killed him, and what was his son's name? Was
forgive me, I don't know.
Yeah, I can see his face.
Yeah, I think he was 16 at the time too.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's really hard to follow if you forgive me, but basically, for people who haven't looked in this before, how many hijackers were there? They were that we know of.
That we know of, it's allegedly 19.
So there's allegedly 19 hijackers, and other than these two, which this connection now between a Saudi official and these two hijackers, there's no other concrete evidence linking Saudi officials to any of the other hijackers?
That would be correct. This is the strongest link that we know of, that we have documented evidence. Now, of course, we don't have access to all the FBI files with the Pent Bomb investigation and the follow-up operation regarding the FBI. And forgive me, that name of the operation is escaping me for some reason. But yeah, this is the only link that we have regarding Saudi government financing with the hijackers. Now, the other operation I was talking about is not so much unknown to the FBI, and it's not detailed in the FBI files, but it comes from a bank account owned by former U.S. Saudi ambassador to the United States, Bandar bin Sultan, whose wife, Haifa bin Faisal, was making monthly payments to Osama bin Laden's wife, who I mentioned before, Mawida Dawijat, and she was giving it to that payment was going to Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi, but the link is that we don't know yet is that Bandar bin Sultan knowingly gave money to these two hijackers, but the link is there because the payments are there, and that came through the money wire transfers to Western Union. The excuse that Omar al-Bayoumi gave to British authorities because he was detained when he left the United States and he went back to London. He was basically detained. He told them about these payments, and they basically told federal investigators in the United States about it. And when they looked into it, it turned out to be true that these payments. But he gave the excuse that Osama bin Laden's wife was going through hair transplant surgery. Well, I mean, this payments went through 16 months, 14 months of these payments, and they came through increments between $3,000 to $5,000 each time. And it just so happens that a lot of these payments, far exceeded the surgery that was needed. So there's a lot of misconception there, but that's another link too. But that link is basically more covered up than this link that that's being reported on. But this is a tremendous revelation. It just so happens, but it just goes to show you why they're covering up, because their interests far supersede even the interests of the victims' families. And that's a conspiracy all in itself. But it's unfortunate that the 9/11 Truth Movement would rather concentrate on the more fantastical claims. Well, here's one here, and it does involve the federal government, and it does involve with certain names that we can, could use in a court of law, like Motley, Rice, and Creedley are. And but it's unfortunate 9/11 Truth Movement basically doesn't touch on this.
So when people mention like the 28 pages, the infamous 28 pages, does that, I'm sure you've read them. Does that apply at all to this situation? Sort
of. And that applies with a connection between Saudi intermediaries in Colorado and in California to certain hijackers. That 28 pages is coming from the Joint House Select Committee of the investigation into 9/11. It's the more less known of the two congressional inquiries, but it's also the most important in my view, because that inquiry was basically concentrating on the intelligence apparatus, not foreign intelligence, but domestic, the NSA, the FBI, and the CIA. And basically it showed that, unlike the 9/11 Commission, the joint inquiry basically tried to touch on how the CIA basically didn't allow the FBI and intentionally withheld, basically, so to speak. I even did a podcast on this called Carl Levin and the Joint Inquiry, where Carl Levin of the Joint House basically is grilling the director of the CIA, George Tenet, and grilled the deputy chief of Alex Station, Tom Wilshire, who's hidden behind a partition, and grilled the director of the counterterrorism unit, Cofer Black, and basically got them to all contradict one another about information sharing with the FBI. And each one told a different story, and basically all of them basically lied or basically subverted the questions and didn't want to answer. But Tenet basically lied openly about, nobody read this cable regarding Khalid al-Mihdhar, Nawaf Azmi, and the U.S. visas. Well, basically over 55 people read it in the CIA. So he basically lied about that, knowingly lied. Regarding the 28 pages, it's redacted still, but at least we could read some of it, where it basically shows that, yes, there was connections between Bandar bin Sultan and al-Qaeda operatives overseas. In fact, when they captured Abu Zubaydah in Pakistan, on his possession was a business card to Bandar bin Sultan, the U.S. ambassador to the United States. What the hell is he doing with that? And, there was also phone numbers to 3 Saudi princes in Riyadh. It just so happened all 3 of them are dead. One, I think, one basically was killed in a car accident, and one actually died of dehydration in the middle of the desert somewhere. And the other one, I don't know how he died, but they were all murdered. But they're hushed up right away. So, there's a cover-up involving that too. And, this is the disconnect between, fringe conspiracy of like no hijackers or living hijackers or CHI planes, and then an enormous amount of actual conspiracies that are covered up by the State Department and the intelligence agencies. But, if you make the claim that there's no hijackers, well, guess what you just did? You absolved all the intelligence agencies involved with who? The cover-up and the monitoring of the hijackers pre-9/11, all these years. And basically we could show that there's an enormous amount of public information involving the CIA, the NSA, the FBI, Israeli intelligence, Saudi intelligence. They were monitoring these people many years prior, not in the United States, but in Germany and in Spain. And, it is an expansive subject, as you alluded to it. Where do you start? Right. And, I go all the way back to the foundations of what they believe and whatnot. I go a little bit further than the average person because I got a lot of time on my hands. I could read a lot more. But yeah, that's what I concentrate on. And yes, there is a connection between the 28 pages in the Joint House inquiry, and there's a connection between a Saudi government official who is a U.S. official as well, and the hijackers as well.
And I think part of the reason why it's hard to follow is just because the names are so foreign, and we're just not used to, because, to someone who doesn't speak Arabic or isn't familiar with that part of the world, it just, each name sounds like interchangeable. And I think it's just, like
it's so hard, isn't it, Patrick?
It is, yeah.
I'll tell you a funny story.
Yeah.
I work as a concierge security guard, and I have a coworker who knows what I do. And at work, I have trouble remembering names like Tim and Bob. And she once told me, "Why don't you make believe everybody's here in Guantanamo Bay, and you'll remember their names?" So I thought that was funny.
That is really funny. And
like, how do I remember Arabic names, but I can't remember Tim and John?
Well, I think it's a bit easier, when you have a still image to associate with someone's face.
Sure.
And, for someone like myself who never really looked into the hijackers or what intelligence was known behind it, what I did find interesting was you had also done another episode about the visa approval process, and they all went through one figure whose name escapes me again, but
Shayna Steiger.
Shayna Steiger. Yeah. And which embassy was she at? Was she in Riyadh, or was she in a different embassy?
Jeddah consular office.
Okay. And so did she approve the visas for these two individuals that are implicated in the recent revelation?
Yeah, she did 12 of the hijackers.
She did 12. Okay.
And in that podcast, I basically alluded to the fact that over the course of 2001, she was actually complaining about a coworker who was too strict in not allowing applicants to be approved for their applications. And this guy, and his name escapes me, basically went and complained that she was too approving of certain applications. And what happened was Shayna Steiger basically approved a lot of these applications that should never have been approved. Now, the hijackers' applications, most of these applications were going through a program called the Visa Express program, where the United States made a deal with Saudi Arabia because they were on such good terms with them and didn't want to offend them, allowed a number of their residents to have temporary residency in the United States using either a work permit or a student permit, a student visa or a work visa. They both have different guidelines regarding both, but with a student visa, it's easier. So a lot of these applications didn't involve like a face-to-face meeting. So they basically filled out these applications, but on these applications, they were incomplete. In other words, like certain applications where the hijackers basically said they didn't know who they were meeting, or they didn't know where they were going, or they couldn't prove their financial status because they have to show a stable financial status regarding how they're getting there, where they're staying at, whatnot. They didn't want to go there broke and whatnot. I don't know, something to that effect, right? So these applications should have been legally put on hold. So in order to have a further review by a committee review that involves with inconsistent or non applications that aren't filed completely. So they have to have a face-to-face meeting. But through the Visa Express program, they were fast-tracked. So these all applications, she was involved in approving all these applications. And after 9/11, when she was going through a review board by the Government Accountability Office, the Inspector General, she basically said that she was overwhelmed with cases, and she was doing almost 200 cases a day, almost by herself, all throughout the summer of 2000, and she basically got no help. And what happened was she basically approved a lot of these applications. And it just so happened a couple of years prior to that, another consular officer by the name of J. Michael Springman, who was working in the Jeddah branch, who also was putting on hold these applications by these Arab mujahideen that was fighting in Afghanistan, that were coming to the United States and visiting the United States, and they too was giving in incomplete applications. But with him, there was a CIA officer by the name of Stephanie Smith who overridden him and basically approved of all these applications. And basically, we don't know who these applications were fighting, and it was like hundreds and hundreds of them. And he basically wrote a book about visas for Al Qaeda. I think that's the name of the book. And he's come out and basically blew the whistle on how the CIA basically allowed these applications to be pushed through, because they were basically under the umbrella of Operation Cyclone, which is the biggest, most successful CIA operation in history, that was funding a lot of these Mujahideen fighters. And it just so happened that, some of these fighters indirectly were a benefit of the hundreds of millions of dollars that were pouring in, not just from the CIA, but also from British MI6, the Israeli Mossad, and the Pakistan ISI, who had a major, major influence and factor into these Mujahideen groups and financing and training them, because the CIA couldn't basically deal with them because the Afghans didn't want nothing to do with the West. But they didn't care if the West was basically going through the Pakistan ISI, because at least they were Islamic, and they, there's that connection between them. But with Shayna Steiger, some people are alluding to the fact that she was indirectly taking orders from the CIA and basically approving of these applications. Now, that's speculation. We don't know if that's to be true, but she basically was never interviewed again after her interview with the Inspector General report. And, she's a major player in this because she approved these applications. And by the way, after 9/11, it just so happened now they put the clamps on incomplete applications no longer qualified for the Visa Express program. Again, a little bit too late for there.
Right. Yeah. She, have you looked at her LinkedIn profile? She's on LinkedIn.
Yeah, I heard, but I never got to see it.
Hold on. I'm trying to figure out how I can. Yeah. Well, I don't want to sign in with my personal LinkedIn profile and, put that on screen. So I'm trying to figure out how to bring it up because I had it up just now. It just, her profile picture wasn't showing. I don't know if you have LinkedIn.
Yeah, you know what? I could. I think this is her. Yeah, this is her right here. How could I share this?
Yeah, just put it up. Do share screen. I wonder if I could stop sharing my screen. And then if you share yours, I can switch the screens around. Yeah, that's her profile page. She's in Des Moines, Iowa, and she has her pronouns are on her profile.
Isn't that something?
Yeah.
It's interesting that these these figures, these government official figures, come out in public, and just what happened recently too. Alfreda Ann Bukowski, who worked in the CIA's Counterterrorism Center and worked at the Alex Station, she now has an Instagram page where she does beauty products and beauty makeup. And I'm like, oh my God. And she's like a really deplorable person. She actually went to see Khalid Sheikh Mohammed go get waterboarded. She took vacation time and went to go see it just for the fact that she could watch him being waterboarded.
Would you go down to her About page?
Sure.
What does it say?
I can make it bigger if you want.
As a member of the U.S. diplomatic corps representing the U.S. government's foreign policy priorities overseas, convinced counterparts, including senior foreign officials, to support U.S. positions in the UN Security Council, persuaded foreign governments to participate in bilateral counterterrorism cooperation and multilateral WMD non-proliferation efforts. I'm not seeing where she says that she approved the 9/11 hijackers' visas. Do you see that?
She left that part out,
I guess it probably doesn't look good on a resume.
No. In fact, when you go down to experience, foreign services offered the U.S. Department of State.
She worked for NASA too.
Yeah, I just saw that just now too. Look at that.
Wow.
Some background.
Yeah. She went to Columbia, so she's Ivy League educated.
Yeah. University of Iowa too. Yeah, it's an interesting story behind her. I mean, I made that podcast on the whim because I really wanted to get an understanding of how they got in the country. You know, I talk about the hijackers a lot, but I wanted to make that connection about how they got in the country. You could just walk in, but yeah, I knew about Shayna Steiger for a very long time, and in the podcast, I announced her as Shina Steiger, and it's actually Shayna Steiger.
Yeah, because I didn't know if she had. I mean, she was literally in Riyadh, wasn't she?
Yeah, exactly right.
Not Riyadh. Sorry, she was in Jeddah. She was literally in Jeddah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's a good place as any to kind of put a bookend on this. It's a lot to kind of wrap your head around. I mean, especially because as I've been trying to get more into foreign policy and focus my coverage, you know, on those issues, other issues in my podcast too, but foreign policy too, I just find it very important to have nuance. And it seems like it's hard to have nuance, especially with the topic of 9/11, and other things like that. That's why I appreciate your work, but I also, it gives you more respect for the work that Scott does when you try to dabble in it yourself and see how complicated things are. You know?
Oh, he's unbelievable. Yeah. I actually called him the Library of Alexandria regarding Middle East terrorism and Middle East affairs. So I lost your face. I only have your decal.
I'm sorry. I'm not sharing my screen.
That's all right.
There we are. Okay, you can see me now. Or you should be able to. Okay, well,
I got you.
Do you want to remind?
Yeah, no, but good, just to reiterate.
Oh yeah.
Listen, it is such an expansion. I don't like if I were to tell somebody who's not familiar with 9/11 where to start. I probably would say the 1979 invasion of Afghanistan, because a lot of the 20th century players are basically starting to be known through that time. But in terms of geopolitics, 9/11, it's very broad and very expansive. And I can understand why there's so many simple fringe conspiracies involved, because it could be overwhelming to just the average person. Like, oh my God, where do I start from here? And I understand the intimidation of it.
Well, of course, I mean, people could go to your channel and see the work that you've done. Otherwise, I know that you've done a lot of work with Reed Coverdale on his Four Horsemen podcast, right? With Ryan Dawson, and I think there's some other. I don't know if you want to fill me in on some of the other figures you've appeared with.
Yeah, I actually David Brady, one of my favorites, actually, the young guy. We had a really good discussion about 9/11 itself. We have Reed Coverdale a couple of times. Thank goodness for him. That guy, gave me 3/4 of my subscribers there. With Ryan Dawson, me and Ryan Dawson, we're going to actually be doing a series. We actually, I came on his show, ANC Report. He actually invited me on, and we had a great discussion about the Saudi link with 9/11. And it was one of the very few times where I actually could relax, because I'm actually talking with somebody who actually knows what they're talking about in depth regarding 9/11. There's very few people I could actually do that with.
Yeah, I'm sure.
And so that was a really good discussion. I did some other interviews with certain people that are not familiar with the libertarian movement, but it's just so incidentally enough, the last 2 years, most of my interviews are coming from people in the libertarian movement, like yourself, Reed Coverdale, David Brady, even the Jackman brothers. I talked with them. That was another great discussion too. They had me on their show. Yeah, but nobody from the 9/11 Truth Movement will ever have me on, because they consider me, like a paid operative from the state. And, debunkers usually don't really have interviews and discussions about 9/11, but they won't trust me either, because, I do believe that there were some conspiracies involving 9/11. So they call me a fanatic in sorts. Well, so I'm like an anomaly in between.
So these debunkers, I mean, do they do the interviews like you have with these U.S. intelligence officials?
No. In fact, debunkers are more of herding cats, so to speak. they don't like have groups or organizations. They exist mainly on viral media, but they're a very insular group. And so they don't like much in the way of outsiders or people that espouse anything deviating from like the narrative of like Islamic fundamentalists hating our freedoms or something like that.
Oh, okay.
You know, that's what they generally believe, but you know, that's false too. And you know, I rail more on the truther aspect because it basically hurts because they're more out in the open and they're supposed to be about the truth. They're supposed to be about reaching people about the facts of 9/11. For them to propagate a lot of these fringe conspiracies hurt the truth movement. Not only do that, they drag people like myself and Ryan Dawson and Nelson Martins, you know, or Robbie Martin or John Gold. They're reputable researchers right in with the fringe movement. We're not with that. You know, we try to be as careful as possible because we want to share information that the people can use. You know, like I always tell Ed, like in my videos, I'm ad nauseum in my repeating of, I don't want followers, but I want leaders. So in other words, people that follow my channel, I want them to come away knowing something, not believing something, because we can go to court with knowledge. That's information, but you can't go to court and basically say, yeah, I believe that the hijackers are still alive, because what's going to happen is you're going to get treated like April Gallup. And for those who don't know who April Gallup is, April Gallup was actually an employee of the Pentagon, and she was interviewed by members of this group called Citizens Investigation Team, where she basically says that when she walked out to the Pentagon, she didn't see any plane debris. But it just so happens that in her oral testimony to the Pentagon Oral History Department, she basically says that when she was heading on the outside of the Pentagon, she fainted. She didn't even know what she was saying, but they took her words out of context. And just recently, Barbara Honegger, who's another fringe conspiracist of the 9/11 Truth Movement and the most prominent one of all, she basically twisted April Gallup's words and says, oh, there was no plane that hit the Pentagon. And she actually went to court and sued, April Gallup sued Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, and Richard Myers, and then later on did a second civil suit. And who did she sue? American Airlines and Osama bin Laden, because she says, if the theory is true that a plane hit the Pentagon, then I'm a victim of it. Well, guess what happened? The judge saw the lawsuit and basically threw it out because it was frivolous. And not only that, the lawsuit was so frivolous that he basically fined her lawyers like $15,000 each.
Yeah.
And so that's what's awaiting these fringe conspiracies like Barbara Honegger and the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry if they ever talk about no planes or living hijackers, because that's what awaits for them, because people like Barbara Honegger and Richard Gates believe that. And they're on the board of this Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry. Why? How could a law firm basically employ these people that propagate these false theories? I don't know what to tell you, but that's why I'm so critical of them more than I am of debunkers, is because they are supposed to be representing the people, and not just the people, more importantly, the victims' families. And yet they're propagating these theories and basically saying, oh, your family victim didn't die at the Pentagon or didn't die at the World Trade Center, or that we don't know what happened to them, or that they were killed by members of the U.S. military, you know, some outrageous thing. And basically just spits in the face of these people. So I'm very, very critical of these people.
Well, I wonder if at some point in time it turns into a career path. I mean, you get so tied into being, I don't know, this is just speculative, but I mean, there's incentive if you make a career out of 9/11 truth or something like that, then you get so wrapped up in it that you just have to keep it going. I mean, I'm sure there's not a whole lot of money in it. So,
you know what? It's funny that you bring this up, Patrick, because when I was on Facebook and I just reactivated it to post some stuff for a week and I deactivated. But 3 years ago, I ran into Barbara Honegger and we had a long discussion on there. And she basically called me a government agent. I said, you know what's funny, Barbara? You actually work for the State Department under Reagan. You actually propagate theories that help cover up the actual anomalies involving the CIA and the Saudis. I said, if anything, you're the operative. And by the way, you basically have to keep this going, because God forbid if you actually came to the realization, hey, what I believe was actually false, you know what's going to happen to her? Everybody in the truth movement is going to turn on her, and they're basically going to call her a shill. And who is she going to go to? Not the debunkers who know she's full of it, and not to people like myself and Nelson Martins, because we called her out for so long. She's going to be all left alone. So she has to keep this, like you said, has to keep this facade up. But what does that say about her? Mm-hmm. If that's true, right? If she basically knows what she's saying is false. So that's why I'm more critical about her than I am to most truthers, because she's actually still active. Mm-hmm. And she's a board member for like this law firm called the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry. And, you know, all prominent like 9/11 advocates use her as a bastion of information. And I can't understand like why they don't do it. And what's funny is that they want to believe that there was a conspiracy involving the federal government. Yes, there is. And I just named a couple for you on this show. But they don't believe in hijackers. So that means that those anomalies don't exist. Yeah. So they got to believe in some other fantastical tale that involves with the Israelis and the CIA and the attacks themselves. But they're all false. Like it drives me nuts when you think about it, because, you know, I've spent the last 15 years studying this field, and, you know, I'm trying to circumvent the best I can. I know I'm going up against a tsunami of disinformation, but I'm trying to do my part in trying to inform the audience. Hey, yes, the official narrative is not necessarily true, but these fringe conspiracies are false. Yes, we can know certain things, and we can. There are certain conspiracies that are true. You know, I named some of them here. I can name a lot more. You just go to my channel, go to DJ Thermodetonator, go to Ryan Dawson, go to Ray Nowolowski or John Gold or Robbie Martin. Yeah, there's still certain reputable people out there. But, you know, they're few and far between, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you want to remind people where they can find your work?
Sure. Google my name, Adam Fitzgerald, and put 9/11 right after it. I pop right up. If you go to Twitter, _Adam Fitzgerald, I have a pinned tweet where I link to all my websites. I have a WordPress. I have about 4,600 entries. I'm uploading books, documents, and files from primary source materials that you can access for free. Darkened Hour is my podcast, along with co-host Richard Cox. We talk about the deeper geopolitical angle involving 9/11, and we interview actual whistleblowers on the show. And my YouTube page, I currently have 42 playlists and about 2,500 videos uploaded on there. In fact, I think I'm the only person besides C-SPAN on their website to upload the entire Joint House Inquiry 9/11 Commission report in its entirety. Damn. So it's on there too. But I touch on a lot of other subjects. But yeah, that's all of my information from there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're going to do this again, I'm sure, find another topic to kind of hammer at. But I really enjoyed this, Adam. Thanks for coming on again.
Oh, Patrick, thank you very much for having me.